The hotel manager took one look at her and decided she didn't belong. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check the reservation list. He just called security to have her removed. But what he didn't know, she wasn't just any guest. She was the owner of the entire hotel. And the moment he realized his mistake, it was already too late to fix it. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The Grand Hotel lobby gleamed under the golden glow of the chandeliers, the polished marble floor reflecting the elegance of the towering pillars that lined the entrance. Guests moved gracefully through the space, their designer luggage rolling behind them as uniformed staff attended to their every need. A soft melody played in the background, blending with the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clink of crystal glasses from the bar. At the front desk, Iris Lane, the young receptionist, greeted guests with a rehearsed smile, effortlessly checking them in with a few taps on the keyboard. Everything in the hotel functioned like clockwork, and that was exactly how Dorian Wakefield liked it. Standing near the entrance, Dorian observed the guests with a practiced eye. His tailored suit, pressed to perfection, matched the authority he carried in his posture. As the hotel's manager, he prided himself on keeping the establishment exclusive, ensuring that only a certain type of clientele walked through its doors. He had worked hard to maintain the hotel's image, an image he believed should remain untouched. His gaze swept across the room before landing on a woman who had just entered. His lips pressed into a thin line. Something about her presence disrupted the harmony he had carefully curated. Selina Calloway moved with quiet confidence, her posture straight, her steps unhurried. She was dressed in a fitted navy blazer and elegant slacks, the kind of outfit that spoke of success without needing flashy labels. There was no hesitation in her stride as she approached the front desk. Yet to Dorian, there was an issue, one he was determined to address before it became a problem. His expression hardened as he stepped forward, intercepting her before she could speak. "Miss, I believe you may be lost," Dorian said, his tone smooth yet dismissive. His hands rested lightly on the desk as he gave her a pointed look. "This isn't a walk-in establishment. We only take reservations." Selina lifted her eyes to meet his, her expression calm. There was no flicker of surprise, no irritation, just a quiet patience that unsettled him. "I have a reservation," she replied simply, her voice even. Dorian's smile remained tight. He didn't bother checking the system. He had seen this before. People wandering in, thinking they could experience luxury they couldn't afford. "I find that highly unlikely," he said smoothly, his voice carrying just enough volume for those nearby to hear. He knew how to handle these situations. Firmness. A clear message that some places weren't for everyone. Iris hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She glanced at Selina, then at Dorian, unsure whether to intervene. The tension in the air was subtle but noticeable. A well-dressed couple checking in barely spared them a glance, accustomed to receiving seamless service. Reginald Vaughn, a businessman seated in the lounge, sipped his drink, observing quietly from his seat. Selina exhaled softly, as if she had already anticipated this reaction. "You should check the reservation list," she suggested, her tone unwavering. Dorian let out a short, amused breath. "Security?" he called over his shoulder, ignoring her words entirely. Within seconds, Officer Blake Carter, the hotel's head of security, stepped forward, his stance professional but firm. Dorian gestured toward Selina. "We have a guest who seems to be confused about our policies. Please escort her out before this becomes a disturbance." A quiet murmur passed through the lobby. A guest at the bar turned slightly, pretending not to listen while clearly paying attention. Iris's fingers tensed against the counter, her gaze flicking between them, hesitation clouding her face. Selina didn't react. No protest, no anger. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced ease before she placed it gently on the counter. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice calm, steady. Dorian's smirk deepened. He had heard those words before. People always thought they had some kind of leverage. "We'll see about that," he muttered, crossing his arms as Officer Blake took a step closer. And just like that, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted, quietly but unmistakably. Officer Blake Carter stood tall, His hands clasped behind his back as he assessed the situation. His sharp eyes flicked to Selena, then back to Dorian, awaiting further instructions. He had handled many disruptions in this hotel, but something about this moment felt different. There was no panic in the woman's expression, no frantic explanations or desperate attempts to prove herself. Instead, she remained composed, her fingers lightly resting on the phone she had just placed on the counter. Dorian glanced around the lobby, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. He knew how this worked. People pretended not to notice, but they always did. A hotel of this stature attracted the wealthy and the powerful, and any scene that unfolded in its lobby was bound to be remembered. But Dorian wasn't concerned. As far as he was concerned, he was simply doing his job, maintaining order, upholding the hotel's standards. "Escort her out," Dorian instructed, his voice clipped and firm. Blake hesitated for just a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, but Selena caught it. His training told him to follow orders, but his instincts warned him that something wasn't right. Still, he nodded and stepped toward her. Selena, unfazed, picked up her phone again, tapping the screen with effortless ease. A quiet chime sounded from the device, but she said nothing, simply placing it back down on the counter. Her gaze lifted to meet Blake's. "Before you do that," she said, her tone as smooth as silk, "you might want to check in with your superiors." Dorian scoffed. "Oh, please, let me guess. You're calling a lawyer? Trying to make a scene for a payout?" Selena didn't react to his condescending tone. She simply lifted an eyebrow. "I don't need a lawyer for this," she said plainly. Blake's earpiece crackled. He lifted a hand to his ear, frowning as he listened. Then, just as he was about to take another step forward, his entire posture stiffened. A second later, he straightened and turned to Dorian, his expression unreadable. "Sir," Blake said slowly, his voice careful, "I need a moment." Dorian's brows pulled together. "A moment for what?" Blake didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed a button on his radio, murmuring something too low for the others to hear. Selena watched with mild amusement as his shoulders tensed, his stance shifting ever so slightly. It was subtle, but she recognized it for what it was: hesitation. Reginald Vaughn, the businessman lounging nearby, set down his drink, his sharp gaze taking in the unfolding drama. He crossed one leg over the other, leaning forward slightly as if he had just realized he was watching something far more entertaining than his usual business calls. Iris, the receptionist, swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she tapped into the reservation system. She had seen the woman's name when Selena first walked up, but now curiosity and unease made her check again. Her breath hitched. Dorian, growing impatient, waved a dismissive hand. "If you're not going to remove her, I'll call the police myself." Blake lifted his head then, his expression unreadable. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said. Dorian's eyes narrowed. "And why not?" Blake hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Because I think you just made a serious mistake." And just like that, the tension in the room shifted again, this time thick enough to cut through. Dorian's jaw tightened at Blake's words. A mistake? He had been running this hotel for years. He knew exactly what he was doing. His eyes darted between Blake and Selena, irritation flaring in his chest. This woman had walked in, acting as if she belonged in a place like this, and now his own security was hesitating. "I don't have time for games, Blake," Dorian said sharply. "Either you escort her out, or I will call the police myself." Blake remained still, his lips pressing into a firm line. He seemed to be waiting for something, some confirmation that hadn't yet arrived. His earpiece crackled again, and this time, his entire posture changed. His gaze flicked to Selena, then back to Dorian. "Sir," Blake said carefully, lowering his voice, "I strongly suggest you hold off on that call." Dorian let out a short, humorless laugh. "And why would I do that?" Before Blake could respond, a sudden ding echoed from the front desk. Iris, the receptionist, had gone pale. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen. Dorian frowned. "What now?" Iris swallowed, her voice coming out in a whisper. "Sir, I just pulled up the reservation." Dorian rolled his eyes. "And?" Iris lifted her gaze, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the monitor toward him. Dorian's smirk faltered as his eyes scanned the screen. There, in bold letters, was a name he had failed to check earlier. Selina Calloway. But it wasn't just the name that made his stomach drop. It was the title right beneath it. Owner and CEO, Calloway International Hotels. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. The murmurs in the lobby grew louder as nearby guests took notice of the shift in energy. Even Reginald Vaughn, who had been quietly observing, let out a low whistle under his breath. Selina watched Dorian's expression carefully, her eyes unwavering. She hadn't needed to argue, hadn't needed to raise her voice. The truth had spoken for itself. Dorian's mouth opened, then closed. A strange, hollow sensation settled in his chest. His mind scrambled for an explanation, some way to justify what he had just done. Selina finally broke the silence. "Would you like to reconsider your request to have me escorted out?" she asked, her voice cool and controlled. Dorian took a step back, his throat dry. I didn't realize." Selina let out a quiet sigh. "You didn't bother to." Blake exhaled slowly, now fully understanding the weight of the situation. His stance relaxed slightly, but his gaze remained locked on Dorian, waiting to see how the hotel manager would respond. Dorian, however, felt the world closing in around him. His confidence, once so unwavering, now teetered on the edge of collapse. And for the first time that night, he realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. The weight of the moment pressed down on Dorian like a crushing force. His mind raced for a way out, an excuse, something, anything, that could undo the damage. But there was nothing. The name on the screen, the stares from the guests, the quiet authority in Selina's posture, it was all undeniable. Blake stepped back slightly, no longer seeing Selina as a potential problem, but as someone far above his pay grade. Even Iris, the receptionist, looked like she wanted to disappear behind the desk. Selina remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the counter. "I walked in here like any other guest," she said, her voice even. "I wasn't loud, I wasn't disruptive, I simply came to check in. But instead of treating me like a paying customer, you treated me like a trespasser." Dorian's throat tightened. "Miss Calloway, Selina raised a hand, silencing him with a quiet authority that made his stomach twist. "I don't need your excuses," she said. "I need an answer." Dorian swallowed hard. "An answer?" Selina tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Wakefield, what made you assume I didn't belong here?" A hush fell over the lobby. The tension was suffocating now, the weight of her words pressing into the space between them. Dorian felt a bead of sweat forming at his temple. He could feel the stares from all around him. The guests, the staff, even Blake, waiting for his response. Reginald Vaughn, still lounging in the corner, chuckled under his breath. "This should be interesting," he murmured, taking another slow sip of his drink. Dorian's mouth felt dry. "It was a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "I didn't recognize you, and—" "You didn't check the reservation list," Selina interjected. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. "You didn't ask for my name. You didn't treat me like any other guest. You took one look at me and decided I couldn't possibly belong here." Dorian's hands clenched at his sides. His carefully built authority, his years of experience running this hotel, none of it seemed to matter anymore. The power had shifted entirely, and he had nowhere to run. Selina exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "You see, Mr. Wakefield, this hotel isn't just a business to me. It's part of an entire brand, a brand that prides itself on inclusivity and professionalism." She let her gaze sweep across the room. "But what I experienced here tonight was neither of those things." Blake shifted uncomfortably. Iris kept her eyes down, her fingers still gripping the edge of the desk. The guests who had been watching so intently now whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others glancing at Dorian with expressions of disapproval. Dorian's confidence was unraveling faster than he could control. His heart pounded in his chest as Selina straightened, her presence commanding the space in a way that made him feel smaller than ever. "You judged me before I even spoke," Selina said softly. "And now, Mr. Wakefield, I have to decide what to do about that." Dorian's stomach twisted into a knot. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the fact that she had the power to fire him on the spot, or the fact that she hadn't done it yet. because the way she was looking at him now, he knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. Dorian's pulse pounded in his ears as Selena's words hung in the air. The polished floors beneath his feet suddenly felt unstable, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. His usual confidence, the arrogance he had worn like armor for years, was slipping fast. Selena let the silence stretch, giving him time to squirm under the weight of his own actions. The murmurs in the lobby had grown louder now, no longer just whispers but full conversations. Some guests watched with thinly veiled amusement, while others shook their heads in quiet disapproval. Even the hotel staff, who had long accepted Dorian's authoritative ways, looked uneasy. Blake shifted beside him, jaw tight. He had spent years enforcing the hotel's rules, following Dorian's orders without question, but tonight, for the first time, he realized how easily those orders could have led him into a serious mistake. Dorian cleared his throat, straightening his shoulders in a desperate attempt to regain control. "Miss Calloway," he started, forcing a thin smile, "this is obviously a misunderstanding. Had I known who you were, I would have—" Selena's eyes sharpened, stopping him mid-sentence. "You would have what?" she asked. Her voice was calm, yet laced with something far more powerful than anger: certainty. Dorian hesitated. I would have treated you with the respect you deserve," he stammered. Selena's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "So, respect is based on status, then?" Dorian's stomach dropped. He had walked straight into a trap of his own making. "You didn't hesitate when you dismissed me," Selena continued, her voice smooth but unrelenting. "You didn't hesitate when you called security. But now, after seeing my name on a screen, suddenly I deserve respect?" She took a slow step forward. "Tell me, Mr. Wakefield, if I had been someone without power, would you have even let me explain myself?" Dorian's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to spin some sort of excuse, but deep down, he knew there was nothing he could say that would fix this. Iris swallowed hard behind the counter, looking anywhere but at Dorian. Blake stood rigid beside them, arms crossed, silently absorbing every word. Reginald Vaughn, still seated in the lounge, chuckled and shook his head. "This is what happens when you judge a book by its cover," he murmured under his breath, though loud enough for others to hear. Selena exhaled slowly and reached for her phone again, her fingers moving with practiced ease. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't emotional. She was simply handling the situation. Dorian's palms began to sweat as he glanced toward the elevator, as if escape were an option. But there was no running from this. "Miss Calloway," he said quickly, his voice almost pleading, "I assure you this was not personal. I was only following the hotel's—" Selena's gaze hardened. "The hotel's what, Mr. Wakefield?" Dorian hesitated. He had no real answer. Selena glanced toward Iris. "Tell me," she said, her tone shifting ever so slightly, "what does the hotel's policy say about how all guests should be treated?" Iris's eyes darted to Dorian, panic flashing across her face. She knew the answer, but saying it out loud would only dig his grave deeper. The tension in the air grew thick, pressing down on everyone like a storm about to break. Dorian could feel it now, the shift he couldn't control, the realization that this wasn't going away. And for the first time in his career, he had no idea how to fix it. The air in the lobby had turned heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that made every second stretch longer. Dorian's fingers twitched at his sides, his mind scrambling for a way to turn this around. But no matter how he framed it, the truth stood tall in front of him, unshaken, unbothered, and completely in control. Iris hesitated, her hands tightening on the desk. She flicked another nervous glance at Dorian, as if silently asking for permission to speak, but he gave her nothing. He was too busy trying to maintain his crumbling authority. Selena didn't press her, but she didn't let the moment pass either. "I'll help you," she said, her voice cool and unwavering. "The hotel's policy states that every guest should be treated with dignity and professionalism, regardless of their background, appearance, or perceived status." Iris's lips parted slightly, her shoulders sagging with relief as Selena answered the question for her. She gave a small nod, confirming the words without having to say them herself. Selena's gaze returned to Dorian. "So tell me, did you follow that policy tonight?" Dorian swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He hesitated, then forced out, I may have acted too quickly. A scoff came from the lounge. Reginald Vaughn, who had been quietly watching the entire scene unfold, shook his head. No, you didn't act too quickly, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. You acted exactly the way you wanted to. A few murmurs rippled through the guests. Some nodded in agreement, while others gave Dorian looks of disapproval. He could feel his control slipping further, piece by piece, and his usual sharp tongue felt dull in the face of the growing scrutiny. Selina leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. You see, Mr. Wakefield, your mistake wasn't just about me, she continued. Your mistake was assuming that I had no power, that I had no right to be here. She let her words settle before delivering the final blow. And now, you're realizing just how wrong you were. Dorian exhaled sharply through his nose. His carefully built reputation, his years of running this hotel the way he saw fit, it was all crumbling right in front of him. And the worst part, he had done it to himself. Blake Carter, who had been silently watching, finally spoke. Miss Calloway, he said, his voice measured, how would you like to proceed? Dorian turned his head sharply toward the security officer, a flicker of panic crossing his face. Blake didn't look at him. He was waiting for her decision now. Selina studied Dorian for a moment, then slowly straightened, exuding the same effortless authority she had maintained from the start. I'll let you know soon, she said simply, picking up her phone and slipping it into her bag. Dorian blinked. Wait, what does that mean? Selina turned toward the elevator, adjusting her blazer with quiet ease. It means, she said over her shoulder, that your future here is no longer in your hands, Mr. Wakefield. With that, she walked away, leaving the entire lobby in the stunned silence. And for the first time in his life, Dorian Wakefield was no longer the one in control. Dorian stood frozen, his mind racing as Selina disappeared into the elevator. The soft ding of the doors closing echoed through the silent lobby, sealing the moment like a final blow. His hands clenched at his sides, but there was nothing to grip, nothing to hold on to as the reality of his situation sank in. Blake shifted beside him, arms crossed, watching him carefully. The security officer had spent years enforcing rules without question, trusting that the people in charge knew best. But tonight, he had witnessed something different, something that made him rethink everything he had come to accept. Iris still stood behind the desk, her fingers gripping the edges of the counter as if grounding herself. She could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken judgment now directed toward Dorian instead of Selina. Guests whispered in hushed tones, some shaking their heads, others openly staring. The confidence Dorian once carried so effortlessly was gone, stripped away piece by piece. Reginald Vaughn leaned back in his chair, smirking as he swirled the drink in his glass. You really messed that up, didn't you? He said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Dorian's jaw tightened. He turned sharply toward Blake, his voice low but tense. You should have backed me up. Blake's expression remained unreadable. I think you backed yourself into this one just fine. Dorian exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had handled guests like this before, people who didn't fit his vision of what the hotel represented, and it had never backfired. Not like this. A sharp chime from his phone pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. He pulled it from his pocket, his breath hitching when he saw the message waiting for him. Urgent, call from corporate. Now his stomach twisted. There was no doubt in his mind who had made that call. He swallowed hard, his fingers trembling slightly as he tapped the screen. The line barely rang before a clipped voice answered on the other end. Dorian, the voice said, sharp and direct. We have a serious problem. Dorian straightened, forcing his usual confidence into his tone. Listen, I can explain. No, the voice cut him off. You can't explain, because I just got off the phone with Selina Calloway. Dorian felt his pulse pound in his ears. The name sent a cold chill down his spine. She owns this place, Dorian, the voice continued, anger laced in every word. And you humiliated her in the middle of her own hotel. Dorian opened his mouth, but no words came out. We'll discuss this in my office first thing tomorrow, the voice snapped. And depending on how that conversation goes, you might not have a job after that." The line went dead. Dorian slowly lowered the phone, his grip tightening around it until his knuckles turned white. For years, he had ruled over this hotel, making decisions without hesitation, enforcing his version of order. But tonight, the balance had shifted, and for the first time, he was the one being judged. Dorian's fingers trembled slightly as he lowered his phone, but he quickly forced his expression back into a mask of control. His entire career had been built on authority, on making decisions that others followed without question. But now, for the first time, his authority had been stripped away, and the weight of that realization sat heavy in his chest. Blake watched him carefully, his arms still crossed. There was no sympathy in his gaze, no sign of loyalty, just quiet observation, as if he were looking at a man who had already lost but hadn't accepted it yet. The other staff kept their distance, their usual deference replaced by uncertainty. Even Iris, who had once hurried to follow his orders without hesitation, now looked at him with something bordering on regret. The voices of the guests hummed through the air like static, whispers weaving through the lobby as people speculated about what they had just witnessed. A few had their phones out, discreetly scrolling through social media. News traveled fast, and Dorian had the sinking feeling that by the time he reached his office, there would already be posts about the hotel manager who had embarrassed himself in front of the wrong guest. Reginald Vaughn let out a low chuckle from his seat. "You know," he said lazily, tilting his glass slightly, "I've seen people ruin their own careers before, but this is something special." Dorian's jaw clenched. He turned sharply to Blake, grasping at anything that could still be salvaged. "She walked in without announcing herself," he argued, his voice edged with frustration. "How was I supposed to know?" Blake raised an eyebrow. "You weren't," he said simply. "That's the point." Dorian opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He had spent years operating under the belief that he knew who belonged in his hotel and who didn't. His instincts had always served him well, until now. He turned to Iris, expecting some kind of support. "You saw how she came in," he pressed. "She wasn't acting like someone important." Iris hesitated. She had worked under Dorian long enough to know that disagreeing with him could come with consequences. But tonight, she couldn't bring herself to nod along. "She acted like a guest," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. "That should have been enough." Dorian stiffened. His own staff was turning against him. He could feel it. A sharp chime from the front desk interrupted the conversation. Iris glanced down at the hotel's internal messaging system, her eyes widening slightly as she read the notification. Dorian noticed the shift in her expression. "What is it?" he demanded. Iris hesitated for a second before lifting her gaze. "The regional director just arrived," she said. "He's asking to see you." Dorian's stomach twisted. The regional director never came in unannounced. If he was here, it meant something was already in motion, something Dorian couldn't control. The weight of the night settled fully on him then, the realization that he was no longer steering the situation. He wasn't calling the shots anymore. He wasn't even playing defense. He was waiting for judgment. Blake glanced toward the entrance, where a suited man was now making his way through the lobby with brisk, purposeful steps. The guests had started to quiet down, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't over yet. Dorian forced himself to stand tall, to meet the moment with what little control he had left. He straightened his jacket, inhaling deeply as the director approached. But as he locked eyes with the man who held his future in his hands for the first time in his career, Dorian Wakefield felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Doubt. Dorian steadied himself, pushing back the gnawing unease creeping up his spine. His hotel, his rules. That was how it had always been. But tonight, nothing felt certain. The polished floors beneath his feet no longer felt like solid ground. Every whisper in the lobby, every sideways glance, felt like an indictment. A reminder that the power he once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through his fingers. The regional director, Nathaniel Royce, was a man of precise movements and few words. He was known for his unwavering professionalism, his ability to keep things running smoothly without attracting unnecessary attention. If he had personally arrived at the hotel, it meant only one thing. Corporate had already been alerted. And if corporate was involved, then Selina Calloway had wasted no time in making her stance clear. Nathaniel's sharp eyes locked onto Dorian the moment he stepped forward. His suit was immaculate, his posture upright, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had seen it all. Without breaking stride, he stopped in front of Dorian, hands clasped behind his back. "I need to speak with you," Nathaniel said, his voice devoid of warmth. Dorian forced a tight smile, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Of course. Let's move this to my office." Nathaniel didn't move. "We'll talk here." Dorian stiffened. "Here? In the middle of the lobby?" He shot a quick glance at the lingering guests, their curiosity barely concealed. "Perhaps a more private—" "No," Nathaniel interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Miss Calloway was humiliated in this lobby. If she was disrespected here, then this is where we address it." A fresh wave of humiliation burned through Dorian's chest. The situation was spiraling faster than he could contain it. He felt the weight of every watching eye, every employee, every guest who had witnessed his downfall in real time. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, as if barely restraining his disappointment. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Dorian straightened, feigning confidence. "I was enforcing hotel policy." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "By calling security on our owner?" Dorian swallowed hard. "I didn't know who she was." "And why didn't you know?" Nathaniel pressed, his voice dropping into something colder, sharper. "Because you never bothered to check." Dorian's mouth went dry. He had no defense, no clever words to twist the situation in his favor. Nathaniel turned to Iris. "Did he even ask for Miss Calloway's name before denying her service?" Iris hesitated only for a moment before shaking her head. "No, sir. He assumed she didn't have a reservation." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked back to Dorian, unimpressed. "Do you understand what you've done to this hotel's reputation in a matter of minutes?" Dorian exhaled sharply through his nose. "I've worked here for years," he argued. "I've upheld standards. I've made sure this hotel remained exclusive. And that's precisely the problem," Nathaniel cut in, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. "You decided who deserved to be here. You let your personal biases dictate how you treated a guest." He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. "But Miss Calloway isn't just any guest. She's the woman who signs your paycheck." A few guests gasped softly. Even Blake, who had remained composed, exhaled slowly at the weight of the words. Dorian's skin burned. He had built his career on commanding respect, on making quick decisions that kept the hotel's elite clientele happy. Now, in a single night, everything he thought he knew about control, power, and authority had flipped on its head. Nathaniel shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Do you realize how lucky you are that Miss Calloway didn't have you removed from this building on the spot?" Dorian clenched his jaw. "She didn't because she knows I didn't mean any harm." Nathaniel studied him for a long, agonizing moment. "No," he said flatly. "She didn't because she wanted you to sit in this, to feel what it's like to be judged unfairly, to feel powerless in a place where you once thought you had control." Dorian's stomach twisted. He wanted to argue, wanted to shift the blame onto something, anything, but deep down he knew there was nothing he could say. The cold truth was staring him in the face. Nathaniel straightened. "Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave. Corporate will decide what happens next." The words crashed over Dorian like a tidal wave. His vision blurred for a moment, his heart pounding so loudly he barely heard the murmurs rippling through the crowd. His voice faltered. He had spent years commanding this hotel, making decisions without hesitation, and now, his fate wasn't even in his own hands. Nathaniel gave him one last look before stepping away. "Go to your office, Dorian," he ordered. "You'll be notified when a decision has been made." Dorian stood there, rooted in place, as the reality of his downfall settled over him. He had spent years deciding who belonged and who didn't, and now, for the first time, he was the one being shown the door. Dorian forced himself to move, though his legs felt like lead as he turned toward his office. The weight of every stare in the lobby pressed down on him, but he kept his gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge them. His usual commanding stride was gone, replaced by something slower, heavier, like a man walking toward a fate he could no longer control. The murmurs followed him, hushed voices slipping through the air like sharp edges against his already fraying nerves. Some guests pretended not to look, while others made no effort to hide their curiosity. He caught snippets of their whispers. "That's the manager who tried to kick out the owner? How did he not even check her name? I bet he's finished." His fists clenched at his sides. Just hours ago, he had been the one commanding respect, the one setting the rules. Now, he felt like an outsider in his own hotel. He reached the hallway leading to his office, the familiar, luxurious decor offering no comfort. Every step echoed in the silence. He had spent years building his authority here, making decisions without hesitation, expecting nothing but obedience from his staff. And now, in the span of a single night, it was all unraveling. Pushing open the door to his office, he stepped inside and shut it behind him. The moment he was alone, he exhaled sharply, his carefully composed mask cracking at the edges. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Nathaniel's words replayed in his head. Administrative leave. The term sounded so clean, so official. But Dorian knew what it really meant. He wasn't coming back. Corporate didn't place someone on leave just to bring them back a week later. This was a courtesy, a slow, deliberate dismantling of his position. His eyes flicked to the large window overlooking the city skyline. The lights of the city twinkled, unaware of the disaster unfolding within this hotel. Just this morning, he had stood in this very spot, feeling untouchable. Now he was waiting for his career to collapse. His phone buzzed again. His stomach twisted as he glanced down at the screen. New email. Urgent. Internal review inquiry. His fingers hovered over the screen before hesitantly opening it. Dear Mr. Wakefield, due to recent events involving an incident with a high-profile guest, an internal review has been initiated to assess compliance with company policies and customer service standards. You are required to submit a written statement regarding your actions and decision-making process during the incident. Further instructions will follow regarding next steps. Please be advised that failure to comply may result in termination. Corporate Human Resources. Dorian stared at the words, his chest tightening. A review. That was the polite way of saying they were looking for a reason to fire him without any legal trouble. He tossed the phone onto his desk, sinking into his chair. His mind swirled with 100 different thoughts, each more panicked than the last. He needed a way out of this. Some kind of damage control. Something. Anything to turn this around. Then a thought hit him. Selina Calloway hadn't fired him immediately. She had let him sit in this. That meant there was still a chance, however small, to fix things. If he could talk to her, explain himself, maybe, just maybe, he could salvage something. He grabbed his phone again, scrolling through the hotel directory until he found her reservation. A suite on the top floor. His fingers tightened around the device. If she hadn't made her final decision yet, maybe he could convince her to reconsider. With renewed determination, he pushed himself up from his chair, straightened his jacket, and made his way toward the elevator. He wasn't going down without a fight. Dorian stepped into the elevator, his fingers tightening into fists as the doors slid shut. The hum of the lift was the only sound in the confined space, but his thoughts were loud, drowning out everything else. He had never felt this way before. Uncertain, desperate. Every instinct told him he was walking into dangerous territory, but he couldn't sit back and let his career slip away without a fight. His jaw clenched as he pressed the button for the top floor. Selina Calloway still had the power to decide his fate, and if there was even the smallest chance of salvaging his job, he had to take it. He wasn't going to beg. He refused to. But he would find a way to convince her that this had all been a misunderstanding. The elevator moved smoothly, carrying him higher and higher, away from the murmurs of the lobby and the judgmental stares. Up here, where the most expensive suites were located, the hotel was quiet, exclusive. A place only the wealthiest of guests had access to, the same guests he had spent years catering to. And yet, for the first time, he was the one who didn't belong. The elevator chimed, and the door slid open to reveal the private corridor leading to Selina's suite. The lighting was dim, the carpet thick beneath his shoes, absorbing his footsteps as he approached the door. He hesitated for only a second before knocking. Silence. He cleared his throat, straightening his posture. "Miss Calloway," he called, keeping his tone controlled. Professional. It's Dorian Wakefield. I'd like to speak with you, if you have a moment. No response. His fingers twitched at his sides. He wasn't used to being ignored. He knocked again, a bit firmer this time. Miss Calloway, I just want to clear up any misunderstandings from earlier. I believe we should... The door opened, but not by Selena. Instead, a sharply dressed man in his late 50s stood before him, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. His silver hair was neatly combed, his dark suit impeccable. There was no name tag, but the way he carried himself screamed authority. Dorian hesitated. He had never seen this man before, and yet something about him sent an uneasy chill down his spine. I'm looking for Miss Calloway, he said, forcing himself to maintain his usual confidence. I'd like to speak with her regarding... You won't be speaking with her, the man interrupted smoothly. Dorian blinked. Excuse me? The man exhaled slowly, as if dealing with him was already a waste of time. Miss Calloway has no interest in hearing whatever excuse you've prepared, he said. She's already made her decision. A cold pit formed in Dorian's stomach. Her decision? The man gave a slow nod. I suggest you return to your office. A formal notice will be sent to you within the hour. Dorian's pulse pounded. So that's it? He demanded. She won't even let me explain myself. The man's gaze remained impassive. Miss Calloway doesn't need an explanation. Your actions spoke clearly enough. Dorian's breath hitched slightly. This was worse than he expected. He had thought he'd have time. Time to argue, time to find some way to spin this in his favor. But it was already too late. He took a step forward, lowering his voice. Look, I've worked at this hotel for years, he said. One mistake shouldn't... This wasn't one mistake, the man interrupted sharply. This was a pattern finally catching up to you. Dorian froze. What are you talking about? The man studied him for a long moment before stepping aside, gesturing toward the suite's interior. Come in. Dorian hesitated, but curiosity overrode his pride. He stepped inside. The suite was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, and sleek, modern furniture filled the space. But it wasn't the luxury that caught Dorian's attention. It was the open laptop sitting on the coffee table. A video paused on the screen. His stomach twisted as he stepped closer, his eyes locking onto the footage. It was grainy, clearly from a security camera, but the moment was unmistakable. It was him, standing in the lobby, arms crossed, looking down at Selena with an expression of pure dismissal. And it wasn't just one clip. The video continued, cutting to different moments. Different guests, all met with the same condescending treatment. A young black couple being denied an upgrade. An older woman hesitating at the desk while Dorian barely concealed his impatience. A middle-aged man asking for assistance, only for Dorian to wave him off without a glance. Clip after clip, moment after moment, Dorian's skin turned ice cold. Miss Calloway did her research, the man said casually, stepping beside him. You thought this was about one night? He shook his head. This was years in the making. Dorian's throat went dry. Where did she get these? The man smiled faintly, though there was no kindness in it. Security footage, guest complaints, employee reports. It wasn't difficult. Dorian's fingers curled into fists. He wanted to argue, wanted to claim this was all a coincidence. But he knew better. The proof was right in front of him, undeniable and damning. He took a slow, shaky breath. So that's it? I don't even get a second chance? The man exhaled, his gaze unreadable. Miss Calloway believes in second chances, but only for those who earn them. Dorian's chest tightened. He had spent years deciding who deserved respect, who belonged, who didn't. And now the decision wasn't his to make. The man stepped toward the door, opening it smoothly. You should go, Mr. Wakefield. Dorian stood there, rooted in place. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. Dorian's pulse pounded in his ears as he stood, frozen in place, his eyes still locked on the laptop screen. The damning footage continued playing, each clip driving another nail into the coffin of his career. His own voice echoed from the speakers, curt, dismissive, dripping with the same condescension he had always believed was justified under the guise of hotel standards. He watched himself wave off guests, ignore concerns, and enforce rules selectively. Moments he barely remembered. Moments that had been routine to him, now played back like a silent trial. His jaw clenched as he finally tore his gaze away from the screen, shifting back toward the man standing by the door. "Miss Calloway put all of this together?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The man, still impassive, gave a slow nod. She had her suspicions about how this hotel was being run. Tonight confirmed them. Dorian's stomach twisted. He had assumed this was a single incident blown out of proportion, a misunderstanding with the wrong person at the wrong time. But it wasn't just about Selina Calloway. It never had been. She had simply exposed what had been there all along. Swallowing hard, Dorian forced himself to keep his voice steady. "I've given years to this hotel," he said, gripping the edge of his jacket as if straightening it would somehow restore his sense of control. "I've enforced policies that were put in place before I even got here. I did what I was supposed to do." The man's expression didn't change. "No," he said simply. "You did what was comfortable for you." Dorian's lips parted slightly, but no words came. "Hospitality isn't about exclusivity," the man continued. "It's about service. And you forgot that somewhere along the way." Dorian felt a sharp pang in his chest, but he ignored it. His instinct was to fight back, to defend himself, to claim that the standards he upheld were what made this hotel one of the best in the city. But even as he tried to summon those arguments, the weight of the truth pressed against him. He had never cared about the guests. Not really. He had cared about control, about maintaining an image, about deciding who was worthy of being here and who wasn't. And now, for the first time, he was on the other side of that decision. His throat was dry as he took a slow step forward. "I want to speak to Miss Calloway," he said. "I need to talk to her personally." The man didn't move. "She has nothing more to say to you." Dorian's frustration flared. "She's making a mistake," he said quickly. "She's reacting emotionally. If she really wants to make a difference here, she should be working with me, not—" "You still don't get it," the man interrupted, his voice sharper now. "This isn't about you anymore, Mr. Wakefield." Dorian's breath hitched slightly. "Miss Calloway didn't come here tonight to argue with you," the man continued. "She came here to observe, and what she saw only confirmed what she already knew, that this hotel doesn't need someone like you running it." The words sliced through Dorian's composure like a knife. He had built his entire career on the idea that he was indispensable, that the hotel ran smoothly because of him. He had always assumed that his way was the right way. Now that certainty was gone. His hands curled into fists, his pulse hammering in his ears. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice lower now. "I'm just done?" The man studied him for a long moment before answering. "That's not for me to decide." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. "But your time here is over." Dorian's chest tightened. He had always been the one in control, the one giving orders, the one deciding who stayed and who left. Now he was the one being dismissed. His pride screamed at him to push back, to demand a final meeting with Selina, to plead his case. But deep down, another voice whispered something else. Would it even matter? Selina had already seen everything she needed to see, and now the power he had wielded so effortlessly for years was gone. A slow breath left his lips as he turned toward the door, his steps slow, reluctant. The hallway outside felt darker than before, heavier. He had walked this hotel with confidence so many times before, but now every step felt uncertain. As he reached the doorway, he turned slightly, glancing at the man who had delivered his fate. "What's your name?" he asked, though he wasn't sure why. The man gave a slight smirk, something almost amused flashing in his eyes. "Lucas Calloway," he said. Dorian's stomach dropped. Calloway. Selina hadn't just come here alone. She had brought her brother. His breath hitched slightly, but he said nothing more. There was no point. Without another word, he stepped out of the suite, the door clicking shut behind him. For the first time in his career, Dorian Wakefield had nowhere left to go. Dorian's footsteps felt heavier than ever as he walked down the silent hallway. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by an unsettling emptiness in his chest. He had spent years moving through this hotel like he owned it, making decisions without hesitation, expecting obedience from everyone around him. But now each step felt uncertain. The walls, the chandeliers, the polished floors, everything that once felt like an extension of his power, now felt like they belonged to someone else. Because they did. He stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut with a soft chime, enclosing him in silence. His reflection stared back at him in the mirrored panel, but he barely recognized the man looking back. His normally sharp features were tight with tension, his jaw clenched. For the first time in years, he looked small. The elevator hummed as it descended, the weight of everything pressing harder against him. The meeting with Lucas Calloway had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He had assumed he was dealing with a wealthy, high-status guest who had taken offense too easily. But Selena had come prepared. She hadn't just come as an individual, she had come with power, with strategy. And the worst part, she had expected him to fail this test. The proof had been right there on the laptop. Not just tonight's incident, but moments from years of him running this hotel exactly the way he thought it should be run. He had never considered himself unfair, never thought of himself as prejudiced, but the evidence was right in front of him. Clip after clip, guest after guest. His stomach churned. The elevator doors slid open, and the low hum of voices filled his ears again. The lobby was still busy, though the earlier tension had settled into something quieter. Staff members whispered behind the desk, casting quick glances in his direction. Guests who had been present for the confrontation were still lingering, their gazes following him as he stepped out. Dorian forced his shoulders back, trying to maintain what little dignity he had left. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. He made his way toward his office, passing by the front desk where Iris stood stiffly, pretending to organize papers. She barely met his gaze as he walked past. That was another thing he wasn't used to, being ignored. He had ruled this hotel with sharp authority, always expecting staff to acknowledge his presence, to move when he spoke. But now the air had changed. People weren't avoiding eye contact out of respect. They were waiting for him to be gone. He reached his office door and pushed it open, stepping inside. The familiar space, usually a place of command and control, now felt cold, foreign. He closed the door behind him, exhaling slowly. His phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and stared at the screen. New email, termination notice. His fingers tightened around the device. Slowly, he tapped the screen, opening the message. Mr. Wakefield, following the internal review and direct orders from hotel ownership, your employment with Calloway International Hotels is officially terminated, effective immediately. You are required to vacate your office within the hour. Security will be present to oversee your departure. Any attempt to interfere with staff or disrupt hotel operations will result in further legal action. We appreciate your years of service and wish you the best in your future endeavors. Corporate Human Resources. Dorian let out a short, bitter breath. That was it. Years of dedication, of maintaining the hotel's prestige, of enforcing standards, all wiped away with a cold corporate email. His chest tightened. This hotel had been his life, his identity. And now, with a few clicks of a keyboard, he was being erased from it entirely. A knock at the door made him tense. Mr. Wakefield? He knew that voice. Blake Carter. Dorian inhaled deeply before turning toward the door. Come in. Blake stepped inside, his usual neutral expression in place. But there was something different in his eyes. Not pity, not sympathy, but a quiet understanding. You saw the email? Blake said, more a statement than a question. Dorian let out a dry chuckle. Oh yeah, I saw it. He set his phone on the desk. Corporate efficiency at its finest. Blake didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied Dorian for a long moment before finally speaking. You know, he said, I worked under you for years. Followed your orders. Watched how you handled things. Dorian raised an eyebrow. And, Blake exhaled slowly, and for the longest time, I thought you were the standard, that how you ran this place was the right way. But tonight, he shook his head. I realized something. Dorian's patience was wearing thin. Which is, Blake met his gaze evenly. You weren't running a hotel, Dorian. You were running a gated community. Dorian's breath hitched slightly, but he masked it with a scoff. That's ridiculous. Blake shrugged. Maybe, but the fact that you don't see it, that's why you're in this position right now. Dorian's jaw tightened. He had expected Blake to show up out of some sense of loyalty, maybe even regret for not backing him up earlier. Instead, it felt like Blake was here to make sure he understood why this was happening. I've already been humiliated enough tonight, Dorian muttered. You can leave now. Blake didn't move. You ever stop to wonder why Miss Calloway gave you a chance to sit in this for a while? Why she didn't fire you on the spot? Dorian didn't answer. Because she wanted you to feel it, Blake continued. To feel what it's like to be judged before you even speak. To feel powerless in a place where you should have had the same respect as anyone else. Dorian's throat tightened. I get it, he snapped. I made a mistake. I lost my job. Lesson learned. Blake studied him for a moment longer, then shook his head. No, he said. You still don't get it. Dorian clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had spent his career deciding who belonged and who didn't, and now he was the one being shown the door. Blake finally stepped back. Security will be here soon, he said. I suggest you pack up. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Dorian standing alone in his office, his former office. The reality hit him like a freight train. There was no salvaging this, no smooth explanation, no calculated move that could fix what had been broken. For years, he had judged others, and tonight, he had been judged. Dorian stood motionless in his office, his hands braced against the desk as reality settled over him like a suffocating weight. The soft hum of the hotel beyond his door continued. Guests checking in, luggage rolling across the floors, staff moving efficiently through their tasks. Life at the Calloway Hotel carried on, unaffected by his downfall. He had spent years believing this place couldn't function without him, that his authority was the backbone of its success. But as he stood there, the termination email still open on his phone, he realized the truth. He was already forgotten. The walls of his office, once a space of power, now felt like a cage. The sleek black desk, the polished shelves filled with industry awards, the leather chair that had always given him a sense of dominance. It all felt meaningless now. The very room that had once made him feel untouchable now felt like it was closing in around him. A sharp knock at the door made him flinch. He knew who it was before they even spoke. Mr. Wakefield, a deep voice called. Dorian exhaled, forcing himself to stand tall. Come in. The door opened, and two security officers stepped inside. Blake Carter stood with them, his face unreadable. He had seen enough terminations in his time to know this one carried more weight than most. One of the officers, Officer Langston, gestured toward the desk. You'll need to gather your things, sir. His tone was polite, but there was no room for argument. Dorian's jaw tightened. He wanted to refuse, to stall, to tell them he needed more time. But what would be the point? The moment Selina Calloway had walked through those doors tonight, his fate had already been sealed. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the first item on his desk. A sleek, gold-plated nameplate engraved with Dorian Wakefield, General Manager. He ran a thumb over the letters before setting it inside the box one of the officers had placed on the desk. One by one, he packed the remnants of his career. A stack of leather-bound notebooks filled with years of policies and guest reports. A framed certificate for outstanding leadership in hospitality. A cruel irony now. A glass award he had received for maintaining the hotel's prestigious exclusivity, a term he once took pride in, but now realized was just another way of saying he had controlled who belonged here. His fingers hovered over a framed photo near the corner of his desk. It was taken at the hotel's 10-year anniversary gala. Him standing beside the regional director, shaking hands with executives, all smiling in celebration of his leadership. It felt like another lifetime. He turned the frame over and placed it inside the box without another glance. Langston nodded. That everything? Dorian's throat felt tight. He gave a stiff nod. Yeah. Blake stepped forward then, his expression unreadable. Your company badge, please. Dorian's fingers clenched into a fist around the security pass clipped to his jacket, his final tie to this place. The plastic felt cold against his skin as he pulled it free. Slowly, reluctantly, he placed it on the desk. The moment it left his fingers, It was official. He was no longer the man in charge. The officers didn't rush him, but they didn't waste time either. Langston picked up the box while the second officer, Perez, moved to the door, waiting. Blake met Dorian's gaze. "You ready?" Dorian swallowed hard. "Do I have a choice?" Blake sighed. "No." Without another word, Dorian turned and walked out of his office for the last time. The walk of shame. The hallway leading back to the lobby felt longer than it ever had before. Every step echoed against the marble floors, every passing staff member glancing his way with expressions he couldn't quite place. Some looked shocked, others indifferent. A few, ones he had reprimanded over the years, held something close to satisfaction in their eyes. He could feel the guests watching, too. A woman in a fur coat whispered something to her husband as he passed. A younger man near the check-in desk discreetly lifted his phone, pretending to scroll but very clearly recording the moment. Dorian forced himself to keep walking. When he reached the lobby's center, a movement near the elevator caught his attention. Selina Calloway. She was stepping out, her posture effortless, her navy blazer still perfectly crisp. She didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting this moment. Their eyes met, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Dorian saw no anger in her expression, no smugness, no gloating, just certainty. He had one last chance, one last moment to say something, to defend himself, to fight back, to reclaim even a fraction of control. But what could he say? She had already seen everything she needed to see, so instead, he simply nodded. A tight, forced motion, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened. Selina held his gaze for a beat longer before giving a slow, deliberate nod in return. Then she walked past him, moving toward the front desk where Iris stood ready. Unlike him, she belonged here. Blake nudged his shoulder. "Time to go." Dorian stepped forward, the grand doors of the hotel looming ahead. He had walked through them countless times, but this time was different. This time he wasn't entering as the man in charge. He was leaving as the man who had lost everything. The crisp night air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside. The streets were alive with movement. Guests arriving, taxis pulling up, city lights blinking in the distance. But for the first time in years, Dorian had nowhere to go. Langston set his box down beside him on the sidewalk. "Good luck, Mr. Wakefield," he said, though the words felt empty. Blake, standing at the door, gave him one final look. "You always thought you were the one deciding people's worth," he said. "Guess tonight, someone decided yours." Dorian inhaled sharply, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. The doors to the hotel swung shut behind him, sealing his fate. He had spent his career deciding who belonged in the Calloway Hotel, and now for the first time, he was the one who didn't. Dorian stood motionless on the sidewalk, the city's cold night air cutting through the weight pressing on his chest. The Calloway Hotel's grand entrance loomed behind him, its golden lights reflecting off the polished glass doors. He had walked in and out of those doors 1,000 times before, always with his head held high, always in control. Tonight he was just another man on the outside. His box of belongings sat at his feet, a humiliating reminder of what had once been his empire. Everything he had built, every decision he had made, every rule he had enforced, it was all meaningless now. The title he had carried with such pride, the authority he had wielded so effortlessly, had been stripped away in a single night. A car pulled up near the curb, and Dorian barely registered the sound. His mind was still in that office, staring at the footage of himself, years of moments he had dismissed, actions he had never thought twice about. He had convinced himself he was right, that he was enforcing standards, that he was making the hotel better. But the truth was, he had been building walls, not bridges, and tonight, those walls had finally caved in. The hotel's glass doors parted, and voices spilled out. Dorian looked up just as Selina Calloway emerged, her assistant trailing behind her, a sleek black car waiting at the curb. She didn't glance at him at first, her focus on the documents in her hand. Her conversation with her assistant crisp and efficient. But as she reached the car, she paused. Dorian straightened instinctively as she turned toward him, her gaze measured. There was no gloating in her eyes, no cruelty, just finality. "You could have handled things differently," Selina said, her voice calm. But you didn't. Dorian swallowed hard, his pride warring with the bitter truth. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, he admitted. Selena studied him for a moment, then sighed softly. That's the problem, Dorian. You never even thought about it. The words stung more than he expected. Selena glanced down at the box at his feet. You had power. You had authority. You could have used it to make this hotel better for everyone, but instead you used it to make yourself feel important. Dorian's jaw tightened. I upheld the standards of this hotel. Selena gave a small, knowing smile. No, you upheld your version of standards. She took a slow step closer. And tell me, where did that get you? Dorian had no answer. Selena exhaled, shaking her head slightly. Do you know how many complaints corporate received about you over the years? He tensed. Dozens, she continued. Staff members, guests, people you dismissed, people you belittled, people you never thought twice about because you assumed they weren't important enough to matter. Dorian's throat tightened. I could have fired you the moment I walked into that lobby, Selena said, but I wanted you to see it, to feel what it's like when someone makes a decision about your worth before you even speak, when someone decides you don't belong before they know anything about you. She let her words settle before adding, now you do. Dorian let out a slow, unsteady breath. So what now, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Selena's expression didn't change. Now you figure out who you are without that title, she said simply, and maybe, just maybe, you learn something from all this. Dorian swallowed the lump in his throat. He had spent his entire career deciding who was worthy of respect, who deserved to be here, who didn't. Tonight he had learned what it felt like to be on the other side of that judgment. Selena gave him one last look before stepping into her car. The door closed with a soft click, and a moment later the sleek vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the steady pulse of city traffic. Dorian stood there, the weight of her words pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he wasn't somebody. He was just a man standing alone on a sidewalk, staring at a hotel that no longer belonged to him. The Callaway Hotel would move on without him. And for the first time, he had to ask himself a question he had never considered before. Who was Dorian Wakefield without the power? The answer, he didn't know. Not yet. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.